Imagine driving a car at 200 miles per hour. Now rip off the entire front of the car. The hood, the windshield, the dashboard, everything. Now keep driving for 10 more minutes. That's exactly what happened to a B-17 bomber crew over Germany in 1943. A direct hit from an 88mm shell vaporized their entire nose section. The bombardier was gone. The navigator was exposed to minus 40-degree winds. And the pilot? He was flying blind, pulling bare cables with his frozen hands because the control yoke no longer existed. Every law of physics said this plane should fall out of the sky. Every flight manual said this crew was dead. But 10 minutes later, they landed that broken bird on an English runway. This is how they did it. Before I tell you about the 10 minutes that defied aviation physics, you need to understand something about the B-17 Flying Fortress. This aircraft wasn't just a bomber. It was a flying tank, a four-engine beast designed by Boeing to take punishment that would destroy any other aircraft in the sky. The B-17 earned its nickname Flying Fortress for a reason. It bristled with 13.50 caliber machine guns. It had armor plating in critical areas. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't explode when punctured. And most importantly, it had redundant systems. If one engine failed, the other three could keep you flying. If one control cable snapped, backup cables could compensate. The philosophy behind the B-17 was simple. Make it so tough that crews could survive missions that would kill them in any other aircraft. And for the most part, that philosophy worked. B-17s came home with hundreds of holes in them. They came home with engines on fire with landing gear, destroyed with tail sections hanging by threads. There are photographs from a war that look like special effects planes so damaged they seem to defy gravity simply by remaining airborne. But even the B-17 had limits. Even a Flying Fortress had a breaking point. And on October 14, 1943, a bomber named Lady Luck II found that breaking point over the skies of Schweinfurt, Germany. Let me set the scene for you. October 14, 1943. This date would become known as Black Thursday in the annals of American military history. The 8th Air Force launched 291 B-17 bombers against the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt. Ball bearings might sound boring, but they were the heart of the German war machine. Every tank, every aircraft, every submarine needed ball bearings to function. Destroy the factories, and you cripple the entire German military. At least, that was the theory. The reality was something else entirely. The Luftwaffe knew exactly how important those factories were, and they threw everything they had at the American bombers. Over 300 German fighters rose to meet the attack. Focke-Wulf 190s, Messerschmitt 109s, even twin-engine Bf-110s armed with rockets. And below them, the most concentrated anti-aircraft defenses in all of Europe. The flak over Schweinfurt was so thick you could walk on it. That's not a metaphor. Pilots described the sky as a solid wall of black explosions. Shrapnel filled the air like metal rain. And somewhere in that chaos, flying at 25,000 feet, was Lady Luck II. Her pilot was First Lieutenant Thomas "Tommy" Fitzgerald, a 24-year-old from Boston who had already survived 12 missions over occupied Europe. 12 missions. The average crew completed about 7 before being shot down. Tommy was already living on borrowed time. The crew of Lady Luck II was a family. Not by blood, but by something stronger, the kind of bond that forms when 10 men climb into a metal tube and fly into hell together, week after week, watching friends die in the planes beside them. Tommy Fitzgerald was the old man of the group at 24. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Wheeler, was just 22, a former college football player from Ohio who had joined the Army Air Forces because, in his words, the infantry seemed like too much walking. The bombardier was Staff Sergeant Michael Kowalski, a 23-year-old Polish-American from Chicago whose parents had fled Warsaw in 1920. He had personal reasons for being on that plane. Every bomb he dropped on Germany was payback for what the Nazis had done to his homeland. The navigator was Second Lieutenant Robert Chun, one of the few Chinese-American officers in the 8th Air Force. He had the best sense of direction anyone had ever seen, could find his way home in a snowstorm with a broken compass. The flight engineer was Technical Sergeant William Bill Morrison, a 30-year-old mechanic from Texas who knew the B-17 better than Boeing's own engineers. The radio operator was Staff Sergeant Frank DeLuca, an Italian-American kid from Brooklyn who could fix any radio with chewing gum and prayer. And then there were the gunners, Staff Sergeant Peter Pete Johnson on the top turret, Sergeant Henry Hank Adams on the ball turret, Sergeant David Williams on the waist guns, and Sergeant Richard Richie Taylor on the tail. 10 men, 1 aircraft, and a mission that was about to go very, very wrong. The outbound leg of the mission was bad enough. Lady Luck, too, took hits from German fighters twice before they even reached Schweinfurt. The first attack came from a pair of FW-190s that dove out of the sun. Pete Johnson on the top turret called them out just in time. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. The whole crew opened up. Tracers filled the sky. One of the German fighters broke off, trailing smoke. The other put a burst in a Lady Luck 2's number 3 engine before Jimmy Wheeler's returned fire sent it spinning toward the earth. The engine wasn't dead, but it was running rough. Bill Morrison watched the gauges with worried eyes. "She'll hold," he said, "but we're not doing this again on the way home." Famous last words. The second attack came from BF-110s firing rockets from beyond machine gun range. The explosions were enormous, far bigger than normal cannon fire. One rocket detonated close enough to pepper the fuselage with shrapnel. Richie Taylor in the tail took a piece of metal to his left arm. Not bad enough to take him out of the fight, but enough to make him curse loudly and creatively over the intercom. The formation pressed on. They had a job to do. The ball-bearing factories were waiting. The bomb run over Schweinfurt was chaos. Pure, absolute chaos. The flak was everything the pilots had warned about and worse. Black explosions filled the sky. Shrapnel rattled against the aircraft like hail on a tin roof. Through it all, Michael Kowalski hunched over his bomb sight, trying to line up on the target. The Norden bomb sight was supposed to be the most accurate in the world, so secret that bombardiers were trained to destroy it rather than let it fall into enemy hands. But the Norden needed a straight and level approach. No evasivaction, no turning. Just fly in a straight line while the entire German air defense network tries to kill you. Tommy Fitzgerald held Lady Luck 2 steady. Sweat dripped down his face despite the freezing cold at altitude. Beside him, Jimmy Wheeler watched the sky, calling out flak bursts, trying to predict where the next salvo would appear. "Steady, steady." Kowalski's voice was calm, almost mechanical. "Left, left, hold it." A shell exploded close enough to throw the aircraft sideways. Tommy fought the controls. "Kowalski, we're running out of time here. Almost, bombs away." The aircraft lurched upward as the bomb bay doors closed and the weight of the bombs dropped toward the target. Tommy immediately began evasive action, banking hard to the left, diving to pick up speed. They had done their job. Now, they just had to get home. Simple, right? The hit came at 14:47 hours, somewhere over the German-Belgian border. They were descending, trying to get below the worst of the flak, when a German 88mm anti-aircraft shell found them. The 88 was the deadliest anti-aircraft weapon of the war. It fired a shell that weighed almost 20 pounds, packed with high explosive and designed to detonate at a specific altitude. When one of those shells went off near your aircraft, the shrapnel could shred metal like tissue paper. When one of those shells hit your aircraft directly, well, that's usually the end of the story. But Lady Luck 2's shell didn't hit the fuselage. It didn't hit the engines. It hit the nose section. Specifically, it hit just forward of the cockpit, right where the bombardier sat, right where the navigator worked, right where most of the flight controls connected to the rest of the aircraft. The explosion was catastrophic. The entire nose section, about 12 feet of aircraft, simply ceased to exist. One moment, there was a complete bomber. The next moment, the front of the plane was gone, replaced by a screaming void of freezing air and twisted metal. Tommy Fitzgerald would later describe the moment of impact in a letter to his wife. "I heard a sound like God clapping his hands. Then there was wind. Wind everywhere. And when I looked forward, I could see Germany. Not through a windshield. There was no windshield. I could just see it, like the front of the plane had been erased. The cockpit was designed to be behind the nose section, separated by a small walkway and the upper turret. When the nose disappeared, that walkway became a gaping hole. Wind rushed into the cockpit at nearly 200 miles per hour. The temperature was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Any exposed skin would develop frostbite within seconds. But the wind wasn't the worst problem. The control yoke, the thing that pilots use to actually fly the aircraft, was connected to the control cables that ran through the nose section. When the nose disappeared, the cables went with it. Tommy grabbed his yoke and pulled. Nothing happened. He pushed. Nothing. The yoke was moving freely, connected to absolutely nothing. He was sitting in the pilot's seat of a 50,000-pound aircraft, and he had no way to control it. "The yoke's dead," he screamed into his oxygen mask. "I've got nothing." Beside him, Jimmy Wheeler was having the same experience. "Mine too. We've lost control." The B-17 began to pitch forward. Without control inputs, gravity and aerodynamics would take over. In about 60 seconds, Lady Luck 2 would enter a dive that would tear her wings off from the G-forces. Every man on board had about 1 minute to live. What happened next is the part of this story that aviation engineers still argue about. Because what the crew of Lady Luck 2 did should not have been possible. It violated every principle of aircraft design. It ignored every rule of aerodynamics. And it worked anyway. Bill Morrison, the flight engineer, was the first to understand the situation. He had been watching the engines when the explosion happened, felt the aircraft shudder, and immediately looked forward. What he saw was impossible, a clear view of the sky where the nose used to be. But Bill Morrison hadn't survived 30 years in Texas, including the Depression and a stint in the oil fields, by giving up when things looked bad. He moved forward toward the hole where the walkway used to be and looked down. And there, dangling in the freezing wind, he saw the control cables. The B-17's flight controls work on a cable system. The yoke in the cockpit connects to cables that run through the aircraft to the control surfaces, the elevators for pitch, the ailerons for roll, the rudder for yaw. When the nose section was destroyed, the cables were severed. But they weren't completely gone. About 8 feet of cable still hung from the jagged edge of the fuselage, whipping in the 200-mile-per-hour wind. Morrison looked at those cables, looked at the approaching Earth, looked back at Tommy Fitzgerald. "I've got an idea," he shouted over the wind. "It's stupid and it's going to hurt, but it's all we've got." Bill Morrison was about to attempt something that had never been done before in the history of aviation. He was going to fly 8 B-17 manually, by hand, using bare cables. Think about what that means. Normally, a pilot moves the yoke, and that movement is translated through a mechanical system to the control surfaces. It's a lever system designed to reduce the amount of force needed. A gentle movement of the yoke produces a proportional movement of the ailerons. But without the yoke, without the mechanical advantage, you're pulling cables directly against the force of the wind rushing over the control surfaces. At 200 miles per hour, that force is enormous. We're talking about hundreds of pounds of pressure, constantly fighting against any movement. And you're doing it with frozen hands, in minus 40-degree air, while bleeding from shrapnel wounds, without gloves because you can't grip the cables through leather. Bill Morrison didn't hesitate. He pulled off his flight gloves, grabbed the elevator cable, the one that controls pitch, and pulled. His hands slipped. The cable was coated in hydraulic fluid and ice. He pulled again, wrapping the cable around his wrists, using his body weight. Slowly, impossibly, the nose of Lady Luck 2 began to rise. "It's working," Morrison screamed. "Tommy, it's working. She's responding." But Bill Morrison couldn't do this alone. One man couldn't hold the elevator cable and the aileron cables and make any meaningful control inputs at the same time. He needed help, and he needed it immediately because even though he was holding the aircraft level, they were still flying toward Germany, with fighters in the area, with one engine damaged, and with no way to navigate because the navigator was either dead or incapacitated in what remained of the nose section. Here's where the crew of Lady Luck 2 earned their place in aviation history. Without being asked, without hesitation, Frank DeLuca left his radio position and crawled forward to the edge of the void. He saw what Morrison was doing, understood immediately, and grabbed the second set of cables, the ones that controlled the rudder. Now, they had pitch control and yaw control, but they still needed roll control, and they still needed someone to actually coordinate the movements. Flying an aircraft isn't just about moving the controls. It's about moving them together in the right combination at the right time. Too much elevator with too little rudder, and you'll spin. Too much aileron with no rudder coordination, and you'll slip sideways through the sky. Tommy Fitzgerald, his yoke useless, left his seat, climbed over the center console, and knelt at the edge of the hole, shouting instructions to Morrison and DeLuca while Jimmy Wheeler monitored the engines and instruments. Pull the elevator. Now the rudder. Left rudder, left. More. Hold it. They were flying a 50,000-pound bomber with their bare hands, coordinating through screamed instructions in -40-degree weather. And somehow, impossibly, it was working. Let me tell you about what was happening to their hands. Because this is important. At high altitude, the human body is not designed to function. The air is too thin. The temperature is too cold. Exposed skin begins to freeze within seconds. And the crew of Lady Luck 2 wasn't just exposed to cold air. They were exposed to 200-mile-per-hour wind at -40 degrees. The wind chill at those speeds is almost impossible to calculate. Let's just say it was cold enough to freeze flesh solid in under a minute. Bill Morrison's hands started to freeze. Means you might lose your fingers entirely. Frank DeLuca was experiencing the same thing with the rudder cables. His hands, which an hour earlier had been adjusting radio frequencies with precision, were now frozen claws wrapped around wire cables. Every time he needed to make an input, he had to consciously think about it, send a signal from his brain to his hands, and hope that his frozen fingers would respond. Half the time, they didn't. Half the time, DeLuca would try to pull and nothing would happen, and he'd have to shift his entire body, use his weight, force the cables to move through sheer will. Meanwhile, Robertson was still alive. The navigator had been at his table when the shell hit, studying maps, calculating their position for the return journey. The explosion had thrown him backward against the bulkhead. He was injured by shrapnel in his shoulder, a gash on his head, probably a concussion, but he was alive. And he was now lying on the floor of a section of aircraft that was open to the sky, with -40-degree wind screaming past him, watching his crewmates fly the aircraft with their bare hands. Chen should have been incapacitated, should have gone into shock, should have curled up and waited for death. Instead, he crawled, dragging himself forward on his elbows, leaving a blood trail on the metal floor. Robertson crawled toward the cockpit. He had information. He knew their position. He knew the heading they needed to take to get back to England. And he was going to deliver that information if it killed him. It very nearly did. The wind grabbed at him, tried to suck him out of the aircraft through the gaping hole. Chun hooked his feet under his seat, mount, and kept crawling. His oxygen mask was gone. At 25,000 feet, without supplemental oxygen, you have about 15 seconds of useful consciousness. But they were descending. Morrison and DeLuca were fighting to get the aircraft lower, where the air was thicker and warmer. Chen held his breath, crawled faster, and finally reached Tommy Fitzgerald, grabbing his leg to get his attention. Heading 275, Chen shouted, or tried to shout. His voice was barely a whisper. 275 to the coast. I can guide us. Tommy Fitzgerald looked at his navigator, looked at the blood, the injuries, the determination in Chen's eyes, and nodded. 275 it is. Morrison, DeLuca, were coming around to 275. What followed was the most unusual piece of flying in the history of World War II aviation. AB-17 with no nose section, no conventional controls, and a crew operating on pure adrenaline and stubbornness, making a slow, painful turn toward England. The turn took almost 3 minutes. Normally, AB-17 can complete a 90-degree turn in about 30 seconds. But Lady Luck 2 wasn't operating normally. Every degree of bank required a coordinated effort between Morrison on the elevator, DeLuca on the rudder, and instructions screamed over the wind by Tommy Fitzgerald. Too much bank, and the aircraft would lose lift, start to fall, and pick up speed that would make recovery impossible. Too little bank, and they'd never complete the turn before running out of fuel. Fitzgerald threaded the needle, called out adjustments, watched the compass, the one instrument still working in the devastated cockpit, and guided his crew through the turn. And somehow, impossibly, they completed it. Lady Luck 2 was pointed toward home, but they weren't out of danger yet. Not even close. They still had to cross the North Sea, still had to find their base, still had to land, and their hands were getting worse. Bill Morrison couldn't feel anything below his wrists. He knew his hands were still attached because he could see them wrapped around the cables, white and frozen. But they didn't feel like his hands anymore. They felt like someone else's hands, borrowed for this emergency, to be returned whenever this nightmare ended. He kept pulling anyway. At some point during the crossing, Pete Johnson, the top turret gunner, came down to help. He couldn't contribute to the flying. There weren't enough cables for 3 people to operate, but he could help in other ways. He wrapped his flight jacket around Morrison's hands, trying to provide some insulation. He held DeLuca steady when the radio operator started to shiver uncontrollably. He kept everyone talking, kept the communication going, and made sure no one drifted into the silent acceptance of death that had claimed so many airmen before. Come on, boys. We're almost there. I can see the coast. England, baby. We're going to make it. The English coast appeared out of the mist like a promise from God. White cliffs, green fields, safety. But landing was going to be the most dangerous part of all. Consider the challenge. Lady Luck 2 had no nose section. The front of the aircraft was an open wound. The pilots couldn't see the runway through the windshield because there was no windshield. They had no instruments except what was bolted to the center console, which was working intermittently. Their landing gear was questionable. The hydraulics that controlled it ran through sections of the aircraft that had been damaged, and their control over the aircraft was being exercised by 2 men with frozen hands, pulling cables that could snap at any moment. A normal landing requires precise control inputs, exact speed, exact angle of descent, exact flare at the moment of touchdown. Lady Luck 2's crew would be doing all of this with a system that had about 10% of the precision of normal controls. Tommy Fitzgerald got on the radio. It was still working, barely, and called their base. Mayday, mayday. This is Lady Luck 2. We're coming in with major damage. No nose section. Repeat, no nose section. Minimal flight controls. Request emergency landing. All crews standby. The tower at their base, RAF Thorpe Abbotts, didn't quite believe what they were hearing. No nose section? That was impossible. AB-17 couldn't fly without its nose section. But they scrambled to fire crews anyway, clear the runway, and waited to see what came out of the sky. What came out of the sky was a ghost. Lady Luck 2 descended through the clouds, looking like something from a nightmare. The front of the aircraft was just gone. Through binoculars, the ground crews could see straight through the plane to the sky beyond. They could see men moving inside the fuselage. They could see cables hanging from the ragged edge of the metal. That's not possible, someone whispered. That plane cannot fly. But it was flying, barely, slowly, with more determination than aerodynamics. Lady Luck 2 was coming home. The landing approach was the longest 3 minutes of Tommy Fitzgerald's life. He was kneeling at the edge of a hole in his aircraft, screaming instructions over hurricane-force wind, watching a runway slowly rise to meet them. Morrison and DeLuca were at the limits of human endurance. Their hands were frozen solid around the cables. They couldn't let go even if they wanted to. Their fingers were literally locked in place. Every control input was agony. Every adjustment required effort that should have been beyond exhausted men. Down. Easy on the elevator. Too fast. More. Hold it there. The runway grew larger. The ground rushed up. Fitzgerald realized with sudden horror that they were coming in too fast. A normal landing speed for AB-17 was about 90 miles per hour. They were doing at least 120. Pull up the nose. We're too fast. Morrison pulled. His arm screamed in protest. The cables bit into what remained of the sensation in his hands. The nose came up slightly, barely enough. Lady Luck, too, slammed into the runway. The impact threw everyone forward. The damaged landing gear shrieked in protest. For a horrible moment, Fitzgerald was sure they were going to cartwheel, flip over, explode in a fireball just feet from safety. But the gear held. The brakes barely worked. Lady Luck 2 bounced twice, slewed sideways, and finally came to rest at the end of the runway. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The engines were still running, though one was on fire. The wind still howled through the absent nose section. And then Pete Johnson started laughing. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the slightly hysterical laugh of a man who had been absolutely certain he was going to die and had somehow survived anyway. "We made it," he said. "We actually made it." The ground crews reached Lady Luck 2 within minutes. What they found shocked even the veterans who had seen everything the air war had to offer. The aircraft was destroyed. That was the official assessment. Not damaged, not reparable, destroyed. The nose section was completely gone. The cockpit was barely functional. Shrapnel holes covered every surface. One engine was on fire, another was barely running, and a third was trailing oil in quantities that should have caused a fire hours ago. "How did you fly this back?" the crew chief asked Tommy Fitzgerald. "How was that possible?" Fitzgerald looked at his crew. At Morrison and DeLuca, they were carried to waiting ambulances because their hands were too frozen to walk. At Robert Chun, barely conscious, still muttering headings and coordinates. At the gunners who had held their positions throughout the chaos, ready to fight off German fighters that mercifully never came. "We didn't fly it back," Fitzgerald said. "We pulled it back. With our bare hands." The crew chief looked at the cables still hanging from the forward section, looked at the blood on them, and understood. Bill Morrison and Frank DeLuca both lost fingers to frostbite. Morrison lost 3 on his right hand, 2 on his left. DeLuca lost 2 fingers on his right hand and the tip of his thumb on his left. They never flew again, but they never complained about that either, because they were alive, because their crew was alive, because they had done something that aviation experts said was impossible, and they had done it through sheer stubbornness and refusal to die. Robert Chin spent 6 weeks in the hospital recovering from his injuries. He returned to flight status, completed 8 more missions, and survived the war. He became a professor of mathematics at Stanford University and spent the rest of his career teaching navigation theory to engineering students. When asked about his most memorable flight, he would smile and say, "There was this one time over Germany, but you wouldn't believe me if I told you." Tommy Fitzgerald was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions that day. He didn't think he deserved it. "I didn't do anything special," he said at the ceremony. "I just told other people what to do while they did the hard part." Morrison and DeLuca are the heroes. They're the ones who pulled us home. But here's the thing about that day that most history books don't tell you. The story doesn't end with the landing. It doesn't end with the medals and the hospital visits and the letters home explaining that yes, they were alive, yes, they were okay, no, I didn't want to talk about it. The story continues in the reports that were filed afterward, in the engineering analyses, in the questions that military officials asked about how a B-17 could fly without its nose section. Because what the crew of Lady Luck 2 had done wasn't just brave. It was informative. They had proven, in the most dramatic way possible, that a B-17 could survive damage far beyond its design specifications. They had shown that manual control of flight cables was possible, if unpleasant. They had demonstrated that human will could overcome mechanical failure. And the Army Air Forces took notes. In the months that followed, modifications were made to B-17 production. Additional cable routing was added, providing more redundancy. Emergency procedures were updated to include manual cable control as a last-ditch option. Training programs were revised to teach crews what to do if they lost their control yokes. None of these changes was credited to Lady Luck 2 by name. The military doesn't work that way. But somewhere in the engineering files, there are references to the Schweinfurt incident and the manual cable control demonstration that every B-17 engineer understood. The men of Lady Luck 2 hadn't just saved themselves. They had provided data that would save countless others. The B-17, known as Lady Luck 2, never flew again. She was stripped for parts, the usable components distributed to other aircraft, and the damaged sections sent for scrap metal. There was no dramatic end, no ceremonial retirement. Just a broken machine, used up and disposed of. But the crew remembered her. In 1985, 42 years after that day over Germany, 6 of the 10 crew members gathered in Boston for a reunion. Tommy Fitzgerald was there, now in his mid-60s, still slim, still sharp-eyed. Bill Morrison came from Texas, his scarred hands still visible reminders of that frozen day. Frank DeLuca made it from Brooklyn, older and slower, but still with that Brooklyn edge. Robert Chin flew in from California. Pete Johnson drove up from Florida. And Hank Adams, the ball turret gunner, made the trip from Montana. The 4 missing. Members were gone. 3 had died of natural causes over the years, and 1 had been lost in a later mission before the war ended. But their absence was noted. Their names were spoken. Their contributions are remembered. The 6 survivors spent an evening telling stories. Some were funny, the time Morrison accidentally set fire to his own toolbox. Some were sad memories of friends lost, missions failed, the constant weight of war. But eventually, inevitably, they came back to October 14th, 1943. To the moment when everything went wrong, and to the 10 minutes that followed. I still don't know how we did it, Morrison admitted, holding up his scarred hands. I've thought about it for 40 years. Talked to engineers. Read the reports. And I still can't explain how we flew that plane home. We didn't fly it, Fitzgerald said. We willed it. There's a difference. Is there? I think so. Flying is about control. About understanding the machine, making it do what you want. What we did, that wasn't control. That was just refusing to die. Refusing to let physics have the last word. DeLuca nodded. I remember thinking at one point that my hands didn't belong to me anymore. They were frozen solid. I couldn't feel them, but they kept pulling anyway. It was like someone else was doing it. Like the plane itself was helping us. Chin smiled. Maybe it was. Lady Luck 2. That was her name, right? Maybe she was determined to get us home. You're getting philosophical in your old age, Bobby, Johnson teased. Yeah, well, I had a lot of time to think about it. 40 years of time. The conversation drifted to other topics. Grandchildren, retirement, the state of the world. But every now and then, one of them would glance at Morrison's hands or remember a detail from that day, and the room would go quiet. Some experiences are too big to fully process, too significant to be contained in casual conversation, too important to ever fully let go. There's a lesson in this story. Several lessons, actually, but one that stands out above the others. And it's not about courage, although courage was certainly required. It's not about teamwork, although teamwork saved their lives. It's not even about the B-17, although that aircraft proved itself worthy of its Flying Fortress nickname. The lesson is about the gap between impossible and improbable. Before October 14th, 1943, every expert in the world would have told you that flying a B-17 without a nose section was impossible. The physics didn't work. The engineering didn't allow it. The human body couldn't endure the conditions required. Impossible. Full stop. After October 14th, 1943, it was proven to be merely improbable, difficult beyond measure, requiring conditions and luck and skill that could never be replicated, but not impossible. That distinction matters, because once something is shown to be possible, even barely possible, the entire conversation changes. Suddenly, engineers are asking, how can we make this easier instead of this can't be done? Suddenly, training programs include scenarios that were previously considered too unlikely to prepare for. Suddenly, crews facing similar situations have a template. A proof of concept, a reason to try instead of giving up. That's what the crew of Lady Luck 2 really gave us. Not just a survival story, not just a tale of heroism. They gave us a data point. They proved that human beings, when pushed to the absolute limit, can do things that seem impossible. They showed that the rules we think govern our world are more flexible than we imagine. And they demonstrated that sometimes not often, but sometimes sheer stubbornness is enough to overcome physics itself. Bill Morrison died in 1992 at the age of 79. His obituary in the local Texas paper mentioned his service in World War II, but didn't go into details. Just decorated veteran and served with the 8th Air Force. The people at his funeral knew the real story. They had heard it many times over the years. But Morrison himself rarely talked about it. "What's to tell?" he would say when asked. "We had a problem. We solved it. We came home. That's the job." That was Bill Morrison to the end. Practical, understated. The kind of man who could fly a bomber with his bare hands and then shrug it off as just doing his job. Frank DeLuca lived until 2003, long enough to see the new millennium, long enough to watch his grandchildren graduate from high school. He returned to Brooklyn after the war, worked in his family's bakery, and became known in the neighborhood as the guy who could fix any radio, no matter how old or broken. He never talked about the war with strangers, but his family knew. His kids grew up hearing about Lady Luck 2, about the cables, about the 10 minutes that changed everything. When DeLuca died, his grandson gave a eulogy. "My grandfather," he said, "was the bravest man I ever knew, but he never saw it that way. He said he was just doing what needed to be done, that anyone would have done the same thing. But I don't think that's true. I don't think anyone would have done what he did. And I don't think we'll ever see his like again." Robert Chun, the navigator who crawled through a freezing, open aircraft to deliver a heading, outlived them all. He died in 2019 at the age of 98, still sharp-witted, still teaching when his health allowed. His final years were spent writing a memoir about his experiences in the war. The book was never published. Chun died before completing it, but his family donated the manuscript to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Somewhere in those pages is a chapter about October 14th, 1943, about a shell that destroyed a nose section, about cables pulled by frozen hands, about 10 minutes that defied every law of physics and engineering, and about a crew that refused to die. What does this story mean for you? Why does it matter? 80 years later, in a world of jet engines and computer-controlled flight systems and aircraft that could never be flown by hand, no matter how brave the crew, it matters because the lesson isn't about aircraft. It's about limits. The limits we think we have. The limits we actually have. And the vast, unexplored territory between them. Every day, you're told what's impossible. You can't start that business. The market's too competitive. You can't write that book. You're not a writer. You can't run that marathon. You're too old, too out of shape, too something. The world is full of people ready to tell you what can't be done. Most of the time, they're wrong. Not always. Some things really are impossible. You can't fly by flapping your arms, no matter how much you believe. You can't breathe underwater, no matter how determined you are. Physics has limits that stubbornness can't overcome. But those genuine limits are smaller than we think. Most of the things we call impossible are really just very difficult, or never been done before, or most people don't bother trying. And sometimes not always, but sometimes the thing that everyone knows is impossible turns out to be merely improbable. Just ask the crew of Lady Luck 2. Tommy Fitzgerald, the pilot who coordinated that impossible flight, lived until 1988. He spent his post-war years as an airline pilot for Eastern Airlines, flying passengers across the country in aircraft that, mercifully, never lost their nose sections. He married his wartime sweetheart, had 3 kids, lived in suburban Connecticut, and by all accounts had a happy, ordinary life. But he never forgot October 14th, 1943. In an interview given in 1980, 5 years before his final reunion with his crew, Fitzgerald was asked what he learned from the war. What lesson had stuck with him through all the decades? His answer was this: "I learned that the rules are flexible. I learned that experts are often wrong. I learned that when someone tells you something can't be done, what they usually mean is that they can't do it, or they don't want to try. And I learned that when you're facing death, you find out what you're really made of. Most people are made of stronger stuff than they know. We're all walking around thinking we're fragile, thinking we'll break if we're pushed too hard. But we won't. We're tougher than that. We can take more than we think. We can do more than we imagine. We just need the right circumstances to prove it. That's the legacy of Lady Luck 2. Not the medals, not the reports, not the engineering modifications. The legacy is the proof that human beings can do impossible things. That's when a nose gets blown off, you grab the cables and pull. That's when the yoke stops working. You find another way. That's when everyone says you can't make it home. You make it home anyway. So yeah, now you know the story. AB 17 with no nose section. 10 men who refused to die. 10 minutes of flying by hand in minus 40-degree weather, pulling bare cables until their hands froze solid. And a landing that ground crews called impossible right up until the moment they watched it happen. That's the kind of story that deserves to be remembered. That's the kind of lesson that never gets old. Here's what I want you to take from this. The next time someone tells you something can't be done, the next time you're facing a problem that seems impossible, a challenge that experts say is too hard, think about Bill Morrison. Think about his frozen hands wrapped around those cables. Think about the 10 minutes he spent pulling a bomber home. And then ask yourself, if he could do that, what excuse do I have? The answer probably is none. You don't have an excuse. None of US does. The crew of Lady Luck 2 proved that the impossible is just the improbable in disguise. They proved that human can overcome physics, at least for 10 minutes. They proved that the limits we think we have aren't really limits at all. So grab your cables, start pulling, and see how far you can fly. Now, if you want more stories like this, impossible flights, incredible survival, the kind of history that makes you question everything you thought you knew, I've got a playlist waiting for you. This video is about the pilot who landed on an aircraft carrier with no tail section. Even crazier than what you just watched. Or this one about the bomber crew that survived a mid-air collision and kept flying. Click 1. Learn something. And remember, the only thing standing between you and the impossible is the willingness to try.